Welcome. My name is Tal Hazak Lowy, and I'm the Executive Director of Friends of the Children Chicago. We're so delighted that you're all here with us today. Sorry, technical glitch. Friends of the Children is a professional mentoring program serving the children facing the greatest risk factors and with the least protective factors in their life. We commit to standing by each child and their family for 12 and a half years, no matter what. Before we get started, I want to sincerely thank the gracious sponsors of today's conversation. Many, many thanks to our wonderful presenting sponsor, Discover Card. Many thanks to our dear friends and partners at KBP Foods and KFC. And also many thanks to Barry Calibat, Latham and Watkins, Staines Family Foundation, and the Talinci family. Our annual panel discussion is one of my favorite days. Over the course of the year, I get to have stimulating conversation with some of our cities and states' greatest minds, grappling with some of our society's most significant challenges. Intergenerational cycles of poverty, trauma, and violence are the direct result of historically broken and discriminatory systems, policies, and institutions. The reality is there's no such thing as a quick fix to the barriers and struggles faced by families living in communities that have been intentionally under-resourced and underserved for decades. These barriers and struggles go deep, and programs, policies, and institutions must respond in kind. My hope for today is that we will engage in a conversation that helps us deepen our understanding and reimagine the systemic changes and individual support needed to empower all our community members so that they too have a real opportunity to thrive. At the end of today's conversation, we'll have a few moments for questions from you. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box to the right of where it says raise hand. Please write your questions there at any time and we'll get to them later. I am delighted and honored to have with us here today Mary Jo Barrett of the Center for Contextual Change. Her most recent book is Treating Complex Trauma, a relational blueprint for collaboration and change. Chicago Cred is one of Chicago's premier organizations dedicated to gun violence reduction. We are grateful to have with us today, hopefully soon, Arnie Duncan, managing partner, and Melvin Hayward, head of programs. We're also joined by the brilliant Dr. Mariana Soto Manning, president of the Erickson Institute, one of the leading graduate schools and research institutions for early childhood development. I want you all to think back to a time when you experienced some sort of trauma, whether it was a car accident, the loss of a loved one, or your house burning down. Think for a moment how you felt after that experience. What did you need in order to recover? How long did it take you to get over that experience? I'm struck by how many children in Chicago have been exposed to significant trauma early and often during their short lives, whether it's direct abuse or neglect, having a stray bullet come through their window, witnessing domestic violence in the home, knowing a loved one that was shot or even killed. The list goes on and on. Mariana, I'd like to start by asking you, we know that when a child is exposed to trauma, it can have a long-term negative impact on their life. What types of impact are we talking about?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all of those who are attending this important event today. There are lots of impacts of children experiencing trauma in terms of brain development, to attachment, to the development of identity and self-efficacy. I know that my Associate Vice President for Clinical Services, Andrea Goss, is in the audience, and she probably could answer this question a lot better than I can. So look up the Center for Children and Families. But one of the things is really transitions matter. Children have extra transitions when they experience trauma. They're introduced into their lives. And we need to think about how is it the children's mental health is impacted, their ability to feel safe, secure about themselves, the lack of attachment, the lack of trust, and the fragmented relationships. So all of these means that young children are not developing as they should and could, from brain development to social emotional development to their ability to learn. All of these are directly impacted by trauma. And trauma then becomes a filter through which children then see lives and develop themselves and learn to function or not in communities. Can they trust adults? Do they see themselves as safe, as capable? Can they take risks? Do they feel that even if they make a mistake, they are still loved? Or are relationships then really depending on whether they perform a certain way? So we see lots of stress, we see lots of anxiety, we see lots of adverse childhood experiences when children experience trauma, and those impact their lives through adulthood.
Thank you. Mary Jo, let me ask you, what if a parent or caregiver themselves is going through significant trauma? How does that impact their parenting of a young child? Hold on, Mary Jo, you're muted.
Thank you, Tala, and thanks for having me. And I'm going to riff off Mariana, if I may. The piece is, you said, what if? I'm going to say every single one of our parents that any of us on that are probably in the audience and certainly on the panel, it's not what if, it's the fact that they all are children who have experienced trauma and now they're in adult bodies, hopefully living an adult life. And so then the question I think happens is, what's the impact? The impact is all the things that Mariana talked about just keep happening more and more as they grow up. Really concisely, so what is trauma as a child? There are acts of leaving a child powerless, out of control, disconnected from other and their environment, and devalued. So then you think about parents who over time experience their world, their entire universe as, I'm out of control, I have no value based on my race, based on my gender, based on my socioeconomic, I have no value, I'm powerless, I'm out of control of my environment. And then this is the key piece where it becomes this interactional. So a parent is experiencing themselves as powerless, devalued, out of control, and disconnected. They use survival skills that the rest of us look like symptoms. But in fact, they are survival skills. Drinking, self-mutilating, abusing your child. I always look at it as abusing self or others is a way for me to regain power, control, value, and connection. So a kid acts out, as Mariana was talking about. And what's that do when a child's acting out and a parent is suffering from complex developmental trauma? They use their survival skills. So, and what are those survival skills? If you look at them, for all of us, they're symptomatic, dysfunctional acting out. For them, it's what they've learned over time. So the child is powerless, acting out, using their newly developed survival skills, whether that's be a good kid, whatever. Then what happens is that triggers the parent. And then the parent use their survival skills, which escalates the child. And so what we get into is a family cycle of traumatic stress, which keeps our brains completely hyper-aroused, activated pretty much 24/7. And if it's not happening with the kids, it's happening when I go out onto the street. It's happening every time I hear a gunshot. I stay in a neurological traumatic stress state. And it is virtually impossible for a child to learn and function, but it's also for the parent. If that the most important piece is, how do we keep them regulated?
Which brings me, great, thank you, Mary Jo, but brings us to, this is a question I'd like to ask all of you, right? So the research demonstrates the most important protective factor that a person can have is at least one stable and committed adult relationship. What's so magical about a trusting relationship? Who wants to join in and sort of share their insights first? Like, what is the magic of a relationship?
Can get started. I think that from the very beginning, relationships matter because relationships are foundational to infant development, to child development, to adolescent development. A secure relationship is really, really important. So if that child knows that there is someone who has their back, who loves them, who they can take risks with, then they are able to learn, they're able to develop further. It's really important for us to think about how that relationship, because all areas of development are connected, that relationship serves social, emotion, developmental, academic areas. And so it really does matter quite a bit. And it matters even more for kids whose relationships at home, because of a variety of social, political, and economic factors, as Mary Jo mentioned, that they don't have that secure relationship at home. So it's really important for them to see themselves. We know, for example, that Black teachers are so important to the development of Black children, and the effects are extremely powerful. And part of that is because Black children are disproportionately more likely to have experienced trauma again and again. Certain level of stress leads to learning, but there's too much stress in the lives of so many of our brown and Black young children. So for them to have someone who cares about them, who believes in them, and who is there day in and day out really does make a difference. And one of the things that we see is we don't see in teacher preparation programs the development of really mental health skills, of relational skills, so that teachers can attend also to the mental health development of young children. And we, in all honesty, don't see enough counselors and social workers. That tends to be seen more as an intervention and not as a necessary design feature. The same way that we have physical health to the forefront, we have to have mental health as well, because even though it may not be visible, it's truly consequential. So it's important to have someone who looks like them. It's important to have someone who believes in them. It's important to have someone who cares for them, who has a relationship with them, because learning and development, even brain development, happens within the context of powerful, secure relationships where attachments can be strong and long-lasting, so that children, even as they experience transitions throughout their lives, as parents may be deported, incarcerated, as there might be substance abuse and different fractures in their lives, they have that adult that continues to support their development and sees them for their full potential, to imagine with them a future that doesn't yet exist in that child's life, but that hopefully will realize itself through that relationship.
Thank you, Mariana. Melvin, I'm wondering what you have to say about sort of the magic of a trusting relationship.
You know what, when I think about the magic of a trusting relationship, the first thing that comes to mind with me was my relationship with my father who raised me. And I think the importance of having fathers in children's lives. And so the magic of that relationship was I was able to come to my father about any and everything. And we were able to have explicit conversations around things that oftentimes are hard to talk to parents about. And so, you know, as my children have grown, because of the foundation that my father set for me, it was easier for me to have a long-lasting, trusting relationship with my children and my grandchildren. And so I think for me, it's important that we prop those kind of relationship up and try to have the ability to transfer that over so that we start to break the generational curses that are happening in far too many communities across this country. And I also think that we need to be intentional about talking about the importance of relationships and how long lasting they can be and how important they are for young men in particular in the communities affected by violence. And so leading by example, relationships in our work that we do at Chicago Cred is extremely important. This is a relationship driven kind of work, and without the relationships in the community, we can't and won't ever be effective. And so they're very important to me as an individual, but also with the participants and the families that we serve.
Right. Thank you for that. Arnie, I'm wondering, do you have a sense, like, how long does someone have to have such a trusting relationship? Like, what's the working in with that magic?
Well, I've been a little spoiled. It's sort of been a guiding principle in our work, but I was lucky to have, two parents, and looking behind Mary Jo's background in a household full of books. Both my parents are educators, but since I was about 10 years old, I've had a mentor in my life who's now my best friend named John Rogers, and we went to the same school. And I'm now 57, so that's a 47-year relationship. And there's literally not a major life decision I've ever made without talking to him. And we talk every week, including last night. And so in terms of time frame, just trying to answer your question directly, for me, these are lifelong relationships. This is not for a year or 2 years or 3 years. And I always try and tell him what he needs to hear, not what he wants to hear. And he does the same for me. And again, I think of how lucky I was, how privileged I was growing up. I think about our young men and women growing up, single parent homes, or many, frankly, no parent homes. And I had two parents, and still this mentor has been so critically important to me. So I just, through lived experience, I can't overstate how important it is and how long-term, long-lasting these relationships can be. And they just get richer and stronger and better.
Thank
Paul,
you.
can
So,
I
go ahead.
want to say one thing, because I really want to say it to the audience, in terms of all of us that work at clinics and agencies, is that in our research, the research we did at the center that's around the country and even internationally, that what people said, and this is important because you keep referring to the magical of that relationship, and I want everyone to hear that what people told us in our research is that the more, the better. And that people talked about the receptionist being there and acting consistently, the people that came out, that the caseworker and the outreach worker. And so the important piece is how many consistent relationships that are empowering and valuing and helping the clients. And so again, what we have to realize is that it's all of us. It's a team. The good old, it takes a village. The more of us that are consistent, so that even if it's that if the agency is there, and even if staff have to leave or that there's transition, people will attach to programs. And so that's important, because I don't want to put pressure on workers or social workers. It would be great if you can stay at your place forever. But the important piece, I think, is the concept of social engagement, an energy and a philosophy of an entire agency or group, so that the participants attach and have the significant relationship to a variety of people within that context.
So Mary Jo, let me be, to all of you, I'm going to be a cynic here for a moment, right? For the people who are like, blah, 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 relationships, blah, like it's a waste of time. It's a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, you've lived a life of trauma, you've experienced hardships. Why can't we just give people a few sessions of therapy, teach them some just basic social emotional skills, just teach them to stop and think, or just provide them with a job and just everything get better that way? What's the response to that?
Read up on your neuroscience.
What do you mean by that?
The major thing that helps our brain settle, like, look at it this way. I have a concussion. What do we know about when somebody has a concussion from football? Their brain goes like this. And what has to happen to heal that is to settle. And the primary way for a human being to settle is social engagement. That is the primary way to soothe, the primary way to get our brains so that we can move forward in a state of function, is by being seen, being heard, being understood. When those three things happen in a relationship, then we are soothed. So That's what Arnie was saying. That's what Mel was saying. It's those relationships that created the environment where I can function, I can move.
But so Arnie, I want to send it to you, but like, why isn't just giving a job to someone who's unemployed or engaged? Like, why isn't that enough?
I wish it was. Our job would be a lot easier. That would be fantastic. And there's a saying, is a nice saying, that nothing stops a bullet like a job. And the truth is, and we've learned the hard way, and we're learning hard lessons every single day, but we moved our participants to jobs pretty early on. We started doing our work 4 or 5 years ago. And the reality was they weren't ready and they didn't stick, and those jobs blew up. And so we've now extended time, and guys and women, our participants, work with us for 9 months, 12 months, 15 months, whatever it is, until they're ready to make that transition. And you have to heal from trauma. And as Mary Jo said, it's a process. And so just being very real about the goal is not to put someone in a job. The goal is for them to keep a job, to have stability, to then not just have a job, but have a career. And if we could just move guys straight from Cook County Jail or straight from the streets into jobs, that would be fantastic. We set them up for failure. We burn the employer, and we're trying to build long-term relationships, relationships with employers. So they'll not take not one of our guys, they'll take 5, they'll take 8, they'll take 10. And so it is a process that takes time. And to add to Mary Jo's point about a team, we create what we call a base team. So every single one of our participants has an outreach worker, a life coach, a clinician, an educator, and a jobs coach. So we try and have a team of 5 surround all of our guys and create a sense of family that's so critically important for their long-term success. I wish there was an overnight success here. If someone has it, I'd love to learn from it. The longer we do this, the more we understand how complicated and complex it is.
You know, one of the things that I was just thinking about is anytime that I ask people what they remember from early childhood education, what teacher they remember, what moment, they don't remember learning how to write the letter A or learning how to read the word cat. Those are skills, they're needed, but they remember how that teacher made them feel, to believe in themselves. And that relationship is so foundational. It's really important because they may not, because they are coming in from families that have been disproportionately impacted by divestments in society, that they need to have someone who believes in them, in their capacity, who sees their wholeness, their fullness. And it also made me think quite a bit about Marian Wright Edelman in terms of thinking about that you need to see possibilities otherwise outside of your community so that your imaginaries can be more expansive and more hopeful. And you are not just thinking that because you're growing up within a family that has been impacted by drug abuse, that is your future. So of course that there's a lot more there, but relationships really is how we remember and how we make ourselves whole. Cynthia Dillard has this concept of remembering. It's about memories, but it's also about remembering, making sure that even through trauma, as you get dismembered, that you remember yourself through those relationships. And so that's really important because those foster safety, and safety is essential for us to take risks, to do something that's outside of our community, right? I had to have safety as the granddaughter of a domestic risks, and to not think that the highest and the greatest thing that I could do would be a domestic worker. And, you know, she's as hardworking as possible. But again, that safety was essential for me to dare to dream otherwise.
Thank you. Yesterday, I was speaking with Mary Jo and you said a comment, but I'm going to shift it to Mel in a second. But a really interesting one, it's connect and don't correct. That connection is what's key. And so, Mel, I'm wondering if you could say, like, why can't we just teach people the social emotional skill, right? Cognitive, like stop and think. And like, can't we just say stop and think, and won't they just stop and think? And where do you see, why doesn't that work alone? And why is that relationship part essential as well?
Well, I think if you look at specifically the people that we serve, a lot of trauma and issues and lack of trust go back until the childhood conditioning. And so it's about reconditioning individuals and allowing them to process things in the time frame that work for them. And so I think giving somebody a directive without having the right background on a person and their comprehension level and their ability to move in that direction is important. And what Arnie talked about, having that base team that wraps around an individual and has multiple background knowledge and understanding of a human being, is extremely important on what the stress points are, what level of trauma this person has been engaged in, what makes this person tick, but also having the ability to understand how to move a person from point A to point B. And so we can't give a directive without understanding deeply what the background of a person is and what makes them move and tick. And so for us, it would be lovely to just give a directive and somebody move on that. But I think we have to look at the issues that our young people are affected by, and that's generational poverty, generational trauma, and issues that have affected not only them, but their family members. And so we got to go back down into the childhood conditioning, reconditioning a person to be as successful as they possibly can. And once a person starts to feel good about themselves and who they are, then things will start to change. And as we track that, we promote and prop that up so a person can start to move in the right direction. And that takes time, sometimes a year, sometimes a year and a half, sometimes 10 years. But I think for us, we have to be consistent, patient, but also believing in those individuals who are sometimes getting the first shot at life. And so I think we just, we got to judge and assess a person based on their reality.
Thank you. So Mel, I want to stick with you for a minute because, right, so authentic supportive relationships are at the heart of CRED, of your violence reduction strategy. Can you share with us sort of the impact you've seen these relationships have on your participants to sort of bring that to life through an example to someone?
For sure. I think, time and time again, we've seen people who have grown and blossomed up out of extremely hard situations. And so you got people who have been conditioned to be involved in violence for a long period of time. And we have young people who are war fatigued at 21, 22, 23 years old, but haven't had the opportunity for somebody to come in and assess where that person is and move them forward. And so young men and women in our program have had the opportunity to be patient, take the time that they need to turn their lives around, but also have mentors and individuals connected in their lives who believe in them, push and promote those individuals when they're doing well, and have a level of accountability when people are slipping and falling back. And so there are countless participants in our program who are doing phenomenal now. But what I always say, the studies show that the folks that we serve, folks may recidivate into their previous behavioral patterns 6 to 7 times. And so that may be the external conditions that they're affected by, that may be drugs, that may be their relationships of violence. And so we have seen people who have went through an 18-month process and turned around and become an ambassador of hope and peace for their friends and family. And so, we've had tremendous success in helping our young people graduate from high school. We've had tremendous success at placing our young people into meaningful employment, and they stayed there and became an ambassador for the program and their friends. And so success is happening. But for us, we know in the city of Chicago that there's far too many young people in the city who haven't had the opportunity to have a relationship with service providers like Chicago CRED, your organization, and many other organizations across the city. We're seeing success. The work that we do isn't perfect. It's a struggle every single day. But I think for us, our team is resilient and they're focused on the mission. And for me, we couldn't have it any better than that.
Beautiful. Thank you. You guys aren't perfect. I'm perfect. Oh, no, I'm just kidding.
Well, one thing I want to say is if you heard what Mel said, that the piece is, can you imagine if every child in your group friends had also gone through CRED, every parent, every adult? I mean, that's the piece that has to happen, is that as professionals or as organizations, change will not happen in Chicago till we get out of silos. We've all said that a million times. But if every one of your kids their parents, their caregivers that were being able to also get this. If there, this time, the trickle down effect does work. Is that, you know, that's about the only place it works, but it does work. Is that if the dads, then we can give kids what Mel had from his father, right? Or what Arnie had, the friends, the parents, that's what they need. I mean, and so it's us working together to provide those relationships.
So I'm going to put you on hold for 1 second, Mary Jo, because we're going to get back to that. So Arnie, I just want to ask you, because I was struck. So at Chicago Cred, Mel mentioned this before, you guys talk about the notion that you're not providing people with a second chance. For many of the men in your program, Cred is their first chance to succeed. What do you mean by that?
Well, we have a million crazy stories, but just to give you a couple lived experiences, people talked about their early childhood memories. One of our young guys told me his earliest childhood memory was of his father shooting heroin. That's his earliest childhood memory. Another guy told me, he said, Arnie, I grew up in a household full of guns. I wish we would have had some toys, but we had a lot of guns. So guess what? He grew up to be a pretty big shooter. And I grew up in a household full of books. Both my parents were educators. We didn't have a TV. I used to have to stick to my friend's house to watch TV sometimes. But my sister, brother, and I all became educators. I always ask guys, why did you get, what age did you get caught up in the streets? And one young guy told me, he said, Arnie, I just got tired of hearing my mother cry. She couldn't pay the light bill, couldn't pay the heat. And I just had to go do what I had to do. And so, again, people, I think too often say, great to give a second chance. I think in the vast majority of cases, it's a first chance, that every institution in our men and women's lives, families, schools, nonprofits, churches, social service agencies, everyone let them down. We're not there for them, failed them. And what's always everyone has relationships. They all have role models. It's just the wrong ones. And when all of us are absent, when we're comfortable, when we're not present, the streets are always present. Streets are always hiring. It's always a for sale sign, late at night, early in the morning, winter, snow, sleep, they're out there. And so no one's mandated to come into our program. It's not like that. We're just giving them, they often made very logical choices at 12, 13, 14. I was the eldest of three. I didn't have to support my younger siblings, but if I had to, I can't say what I would have done or wouldn't have done. They made rational choices then. And they're just making another rational choice because they have a better choice to make. And so I think for the vast majority, it truly is a first chance, not a second chance.
So thank you for that, Arnie. So now, Mary Jo, I do want to get back to where you started, and I'd like to hear from all of the panelists here, right? So like building on what you said, dream with me, right? In an ideal world, what would adequate support look like for a child and family that's experienced generation and ongoing significant trauma? Mel, will you start us off?
I think, it takes a lot, but I think a full wraparound approach where service providers have the ability to meet people where they are. I think non-judgmental services are extremely important, and those service providers oftentimes, in my opinion, need to look like the people that they're working with. I think people, if you want to build hope and you want to talk about prosperity, sometimes you got to offer that and allow those people to dream that we're working with. But I also think long-term support for individuals who have suffered from external issues that are affected by communities that are dealing with long-term violence, but also personal services for that entire family. At CRED, we have clinical teams that serves the family. We have a family case manager that's working to stabilize the family. We can put 1,000 hours into an individual that we're working with, but if we send them back into an environment that doesn't support the change, we're working against ourselves. And so I think the thing that we don't talk about enough is we can help 1 million families, but if the community and the cultural norms that support violence in those areas continue to stay the same, then we won't succeed in the way that we'd like to. And so addressing the community issues as a whole, as we work with individuals and families is extremely important. But I think more than anything, we got to listen to people. We got to listen to folks. The people that we serve are extremely resilient, and they've survived for a long time with a little bit of nothing. And imagine if we invested in families and communities and individuals who have been resilient, and we give folks the skill sets and the opportunity to do things outside of the norm. I think we would see communities transform in tremendous ways. And so I think long-term support and stability for individuals, families, and community, but also seeing individuals like them who have made it out and who want to give back in return to support families in similar ways that they've received in their personal lives.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Mariana.
Thank you. So first of all, I think that love is essential. Loving a child, but you can't love the child without loving on the community, on the families. We can't blame the families for the divestment that has happened intergenerationally. So one of the things that I think about is the definition of love being linked to justice that Bell Hooks has conceptualized. And by justice here, I don't mean the kind of criminal justice that tries to identify who did it and what they deserve, or the kind of justice that is based on English common law, which is the protection of entitlements and safeguarding of privileges, but really restorative justice, which means that we're all implicated in righting wrongs, that we need to do right, not because we did wrong in the past personally, but because societally, families, communities have been divested. We owe them a debt, and Gloria Ladson-Billings has talked about that and written about that. There is an economic debt in terms of the work. My ancestors' work have enriched white families because my ancestors were carried from African countries to the Brazilian coast as cargo, as property, right? There's the social political debt in terms of the lack of participation in political processes. And we see that now through voting laws. So there's a lot there. There is the historical debt. We continue not teaching kids their own histories. What happens when you don't see yourself in the curriculum? And what happened to white kids when they don't see the histories of Black, brown kids in the curriculum? They get an over-exaggerated sense of themselves and of their place in the world. And we see that how it has really led to the rise of white supremacy, at least visibly. And then there's the moral debt, which is like, we know what's right. If we know what's right, why do we not do it? So that does mean investing in families and communities. Instead of thinking about remediating families, remediating communities, we need to reorganize the resources to make sure that we heal, to make sure that we are indeed doing right. That means that we need to have not only the tangible resources, but also parent-child mental health services. That means that we need to have infant mental health. We can't assume that everyone grew in a caring family and knows how to raise an infant. So I think that a lot of times we spend time vilifying the mothers who perhaps are into alcohol, drug abuse, and get pregnant. But how do we invest in those parents? The relationship, the attachment really, really matters. But if we are really going to move toward that future of justice, of love, we need to make sure that we are not just focusing on the child, and also that we're not just focusing on an external mentor. I saw one of the questions that talked about, what about the families? Absolutely. Most of us, and I even tell my former students and teachers, you have to have multiple mentors. So how do we give multiple mentors to our kids? Many of them, their parents may have friends who will get them internships. What for the kids who don't have those parents who have the cultural wealth and the connections? So it's not about having one person and the mentor substituting a family member. It's about having family members, about having community members, about having teachers, mentors, lots of people. As Mayor Joe mentioned earlier, it is that very common saying that it takes a village. But it takes a village committed to and recognizing that we are implicated in the injustices and that we all need to work together to do right, that we can't excuse ourselves because we are complicit. So I think that that is a little bit of my answer to your question.
I think that's great. Thank you. Arnie, you've had a unique spectrum. You've worked right through K through 12, you've overseen, and now you're at Chicago Cred. Like, sort of, if you built your ideal system, sort of what would you add to the mix?
Yeah, I think we all think a lot about that. What I'll just say is that every kid and every family is unique, is different. And I'll use the school example. What's been the constant in school is time. It's been, 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year, 6 or 7 hours a day. And what's been the variable has been learning. And I think we just have to fundamentally flip that on its head. I think the constant has to be learning and the variable has to be time. And so some kids need 6 hours a day of school. Some kids need 8 hours. Some kids need 12 hours a day. When I went to college, out east, I met a set of students who went to boarding schools. I didn't really know what a boarding school was, but I always think what works for the wealthy in our community, in our country, probably works for the poor. We have certain kids where home probably isn't safe for them, and they might need a boarding school. Some kids need 1 meal a day. Some kids need 2 meals a day. Some kids need 3 meals a day, right? Ran CPS, we would send home a couple thousand kids quietly, discreetly on Friday afternoons with a backpack full of food because we worry about them not eating over the weekend. And so for me, this is not a one size fits all mentality. I think that's part of the challenge, that we really have to start to figure this out child by child, family by family, and give them the right dosage of support, of mentors, of enrichment, of extracurriculars that they need. And that answer is going to be very different for every single family.
Thank you. Mary Jo, what would you put in the mix?
Well, I'm the practical Midwesterner. So I think very concrete and very now. I was one of the very first DCFS workers for the state of Illinois ever in 1978. And as I progressed, people kept saying, what do you need? What do you do? And I worked with violent offenders, people who had abused and sexually and physically abused their kids. And I used to say all the time, don't send people to jail, send them to camp. People need to get out, be in an environment. And now what I know is that context is everything. That's what we're all talking about. And so my bias, and I've been really involved with Boulder Creek, which is for vets. It's a program that I helped create, and it's a beautiful, I mean, of course it's vets, so they have lots of money, but it's a camp where families can come for weekends, for weeks, that they're completely in an environment that's out of the streets and working on PTSD. It's not just clinical, it's an entire context that I go back to, creating attachment and calming down and teaching skills, but good meals. And then they come back to the city. Now, we have had in Chicago, a place that I'm very involved with, which is Pride Rock, where we take men and mothers and families and children out into nature for 5 days, 10 days. And what I'm saying about that, it's that just like Arnie, Mel, all of us have said, people cannot learn, change, or attach when they're in a traumatic stress state. If you're in fight, flight, or freeze, you can't attach. You can't learn. You can't change. It's virtually impossible. So what I think is that we need to be able to create more environments where the natural environment is soothing to the brain, where that even if it's for days or weeks, come back into the city and then are surrounded by mentors and programs, but that in fact, and we've seen it, there's research, look up Boulder Creek, there is research about creating context for short periods of time where people can have intervention while they're not in a traumatic stress state. People, everybody we're talking about live in a traumatic stress state. And so I believe we have to look for, how do we create an environment that is an environment of attachment and social engagement, where there's learning, where there's therapeutic intervention, where there's healthy food, where there's exercise, where there's nature, all things that we know settle the brain. Change cannot happen in a traumatic stress state. It can't.
You all are brilliant. That's why I asked you all to be part of the panel. And this is, and now you all know why these are the people that I love talking to and grappling with issues. We have a few questions that I want to get to from the audience. We won't be able to get to all of them. But I want to start with one that's really important. So Friends of the Children is a mentoring organization. We start working with kindergartners for 12 and a half years, no matter what. And we also look closely with the parents and caregivers. And I really, CRED brings in additional outside relationships to help people. And so someone asked, how do you work with families or caregivers in a way that acknowledges the trauma or struggle that the parent or caregiver is going through because of their trauma, while not undermining them in the important relationship that they have with that the children need to have with their mothers, fathers, aunties, grandmas, grandpas, or whoever. So Mariana, I'd love to start with you, right? So how do we not undermine that relationship if we bring in others?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, I think that there are multiple mentors needed. Most kids who are successful, who are well-adjusted, who have really developed attachment, who are engaging in learning, they all have multiple mentors in their lives, whether it is an older cousin and sibling, a teacher, parent, grandparent. So it's important for us not to think of that as substituting. It's about really creating more robust systems, because one person is not going to be able to do it all. At the same time, we really need to make sure that we're engaging parents. So again, one of our beliefs at Erickson is that as we offer psychotherapy, that there is a parent-child model, so that it's not up to the child to transfer, but it's really helping repair the ecosystem of that relationship, because children don't develop apart from the adults. So we talk a lot about children, but if we don't talk about the families and the communities, really robust community resources, healthy families, we're not doing right by the child. So one of the things that was asked was really thinking about how is it that we invest in families. We must invest in families. At the same time, we cannot wait for that trauma, many times intergenerational trauma, that's showing up through drug abuse, through a variety of things, for that to be resolved, for a child to then get a head start in life. Because we know that the 1800 days, the first 1800 days of a child matters so much, that we would be doing wrong by the child. So it's not an either or approach, it's a both and. And because we know that transitions are really problematic in the lives of children, especially those that have already tenuous relationships and lack of attachment, we want to make sure that that outside mentor, if possible, can continue long-term, so that there is that safety, so that there is that attachment that allows for taking more risks, for seeing otherwise, for learning and developing.
I'm just going to interject I've never met a parent or caregiver that does not love their child or want the best for their child. Perhaps they weren't loved in a way that was supportive and sort of the best supportive, but every child wants that love and support from their caregiver. We have a child in our program that's in foster care, that's being kept away from his mother, whose mother makes decisions that to a regulated mind doesn't make sense and doesn't make him safe, and that's why he's not with her. But he longs for that mother, and that mother wants him, right? She just needs more resources. I'm wondering if someone else has anything about, Melvin, sort of adding someone else to the mix. How do we not undermine the parents or caregivers?
I think first of all, as service providers, we got to make sure that the family, the parents are partners in this process. We can't look at it as like we're saving a family or coming in to help somebody. Oftentimes, these family members know what they need. They just don't have the necessary resources that it takes to help them move the needle. And so if we come in as a partner, as a support system, and we provide the necessary tools for that parent and caregiver to help progressively move forward, I think those parents will be open enough to receive it. Not all, but the families that I've encountered in my years of doing this work are ready and willing to move forward. But I think sometimes environment plays a critical role. And so at CRED, oftentimes what we do is move families that are in tough situations, living in communities that are affected by violence on a daily basis. And when you move the family out, and we know all agencies aren't prepared to do that or have the resources to do so, but when you put a family in an environment that supports the readiness to change, then you see wonderful things start to happen. And so partnership, listening to the needs and wants of that family is extremely important, but also pointing those families in a direction to the needs that they have and organizations that can really support. I think oftentimes we have organizations that are working with families from this judgmental space, or this is what you need to do or have to do. And I've never seen that work. And so I think being open-minded, being willing to meet people where they are, and also lift up the thoughts and ideas that they have for themselves. And the last thing I'll say is the success that we want for them is not the priority. I think folks have to define what success is for them. And if it's moving to a different location, if it's getting a better job, if it's building a better rapport with their children, if that's the success that they want for themselves, our role is to support them and not come in and try to provide a directive that's outside of what their reality is.
Yeah, and again, sort of riffing off what you said, Mel, is that we have to not tend to just focus on deficits. Every one of our family has resources. They might have the resources, and yes, we're trying to give them resources, but what are resources? They perhaps have religion, they have families, they have community, they have creativity, they have music, they have dance, they have cooking, they have resources. And one of the best ways, and Joanne, I think that was a great question, one of the best ways to not undermine them is use the family's own resources to create the change we want to have happen. So go in and start, and with, just like Mel said, you're the expert. What are your resources? Have them to helping you define the goals, but using the family and the parents' own resources to be able to create the change. It comes back to connection versus correction. If we go in with the energy and the attitude of, I'm here to correct you, I'm here to fix you, then it's not a collaboration and it's not a connection. And that won't make change. One of the quick things that I just want to add with all my little sayings is that I've just come up with, we all know about the whole concept of fight, flight, or freeze. One of the things I think happens is when we as workers and case managers and mentors and therapists, when we get working with families with such high traumatic complex developmental trauma, we go into traumatic stress. And what I've added an F, we go as workers into fight when we get aggressive with them, or flight, like I give up, or freeze, I don't know what to do, or my new F is fix. So it's fight, flight, freeze, or fix. And when we go in with, I've got it all, I'm going to fix you, I'm going to do this to you, we might as well be offenders. Because that's what happens when you're traumatized as a child. Somebody's doing something to you or keeping something from you that you need.
Mary Jo, I think I remember quite a bit. I always ask service providers, teachers, to look at the same child. A lot of times, because of the amount of trauma that the family, that the child is under, we tend to focus on the risks. So we see those families, those children as being at risk. Those same families and children are also at promise. And we really need to focus on the promise of the child, of the family, of the community, instead of reifying and fixating the risk, so that we can really shift the narrative, but also shift the supports and futures.
Such great conversation. We don't have time to get to the other questions, but someone brought up a great point, that it doesn't have to be a magic relationship. Being a good enough parent, a good enough anything is fine. No one, all of us are imperfect, right? It's the magic is the imperfect relationship, right? It's that connection that's imperfect. That's the magic. We're not saying that it has to be the greatest thing ever, And we all need as much of that as possible. Today was just the start of a conversation. I wish we could all sit together in the living room and talk together for hours and the COVID was over. I encourage you all to continue asking what we can do better to support Chicago's children that are facing the greatest risk factor. No child is destined to become involved in gun violence or have all sorts of negative outcomes. To the contrary, with proper support, every child can and will thrive. And that support must consist of a long-term, positive, stable relationship. Friends of the Children is a mentoring organization that's about more than prevention. It's about possibility. There's no quick fix to the depth of struggles and barriers faced by the children and families we serve. At Friends of the Children, we start working with kindergartners and commit to staying by their and their family side for 12.5 years, no matter what. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for being here today. I want to thank our incredible sponsors and thank you to each and every one of you for spending this hour with us. Thank you very much and wishing you all a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.